start out by breaking down my material into more manageable pieces. So I threw this CMT blade onto my circular saw and got started. I thought it would help, but it seemed to struggle a little bit. So I switched from this 8/4 white oak to my 6/4 to see if it would cut through that easier. Had the same problem. That's when I realized my blade guard was not parallel to the blade. I ditched the straight edge, and that CMT blade cut through this white oak like butter. Then I headed over to the planer, and since I don't have a 12-inch joiner, or any joiner for that matter, I lucked out that the boards I bought were only cupped. Well, 2 of the 3 were. So it was simple as placing the cup side down and running it through the joiner till the top was flat, and then flipping it over and running it through until the cup was gone, and that worked out quite nicely. Then it was over to the table saw to start cutting out my aprons and legs and side pieces. Now you might be asking, how did you get a straight edge on that side since you don't have a joiner? Well, the lumber company I bought it from offers 1 free jointed side per board, so I took advantage of that. You'll notice that this board has not been planed down yet. The reason why is this is the one that had the cup to twist in the bow. I didn't have a jig that would work for this, and I figured if I cut it down to smaller sections, I'd take off less material as I tried to get this board straight and square. Let me know in the comments if I was right by doing that. I don't know. Uh-oh, that can't be good. I hope this isn't a foreshadowing of issues in the future. Well, I'll get it off my blade and try the other side. Yeah, it looks okay. Well, yesterday evening while I was ripping down these pieces, I made a mistake. I was supposed to be ripping down my piece for the aprons, which is this piece and this piece. But I grabbed this piece and this piece. This is my leg piece. I'll still be able to make my legs out of that. That's not going to mess me up. What's going to mess me up is I started cutting my legs out of this one. I was supposed to have 3 inches wide from here to here to here to here to here to here. I was going to be able to get 3 slats per width. I needed 14 slats. So between this and this, I was going to get my 14 slats pretty easily. Now that I have cut this, that's not going to be the case. We'll see if I can recover from that. But today, what we're going to do is we're going to start with getting my top together. I've got to get these milled down and get my top glued up. I didn't have a planer sled that was wide enough to get these milled down when they were in their wider form, so I had to rip them down. And now I have a flat piece of plywood I'm going to use as a planer sled to get these milled down and get that top glued up. So I take the pieces that I haven't milled down yet and I place them on this sled, hot glue some shims into place, put a stop on the other end of the jig, and start running it through my planer. I pass it through enough times to get the top of that board flat, pop it off the jig, clean the glue off, and then run the board through with the other side up until it was flat. And of course, I get to empty my dust collection. A lot. That planer was making a ton of wood chips. So after emptying that out, I got to start gluing up my top. I ran a bead of glue along the edge of each one of these boards, then using my God-given glue spreader, I made sure it was nice and even. Carefully aligning each board into the position that I wanted it, I started tightening down clamps, being very careful to try to make sure everything lined up evenly and there wasn't any board popping up higher than the other to limit my sanding on the back end. Then it was off to the table saw to start cutting down my legs. And looks like I'm having pinching problems again. So we'll try running this in from the other direction and see if it does any better. No, it doesn't. Let's try a different board. Same problem. Something else must be going on. Let's check out the saw. The fence is tilted in at the top a little bit. That's going to bite me later. And there's my issue. The fence is about a 32nd closer to the back of the blade than it is the front. So it's causing it to push into the blade and bind. Some minor adjustments, and everything started running smoothly again. And now I move on to cutting out the slats for my slatted shelf. If I'd have known how much work this was gonna be, I might have designed it differently. The slats are gonna be 3 inches wide by a 1/2 inch thick and a little over 13 inches long. So these boards that I've got are already cut down to 3 inches wide, so I'm cutting 15-inch sections out. Then I'm gonna put my CMT rip blade on,
and rip these boards down to 1/2-inch slats. I got 15 slats out of these 5 boards. I only needed 14, but having that extra came in handy after one of them split. I didn't realize how much sawdust this thing was going to make, but that blade is awesome. Go check out the links below for it. Remember that top? It's been sitting in clamps for 5 days. Well, why 5 days, do you ask? Because I'm just now getting back to it. When you're not a full-time YouTuber and you've got to work around your day job and family, these things might take a month and a half like this project did. Is 5 days in clamps too long? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. After I get the big chunks of glue knocked off with my chisel, I take it over to my table saw and get it cut down to length with my crosscut sled. Then I'm going to set it aside for another week or two till I get to the point I'm ready to sand it. Moving on, I'm going to start making my tenons. Now, I've never made tenons before, so I decided it would probably be best to grab a piece of scrap wood, in this case pine, and start making my tenons out of that. After about 3 tries, I was happy with my tenons from my pine, so I switched over to making the tenons on my white oak. Since I didn't want to make a new jig, I grabbed this old box joint jig and used it as a dado tenoning jig, and it seemed to do okay. The sled was working okay until I got to the longer pieces, and you can see I really didn't have enough support for this piece, and that definitely came back to haunt me later, and you will see what I'm talking about. But that tenon does look pretty good. Now to try my hand at some mortises. I thought I would start out by using my drill to drill out the ends of each mortise, then come back with my router to remove the rest of the material. I tried this method twice and was not happy with the results. So I decided not to use the drill and just go straight with using my router. Since I don't have a plunge router, I was using the micro adjustment dial as a plunge. It worked out pretty good, even though it was a bit tedious. Well, would you look at that? My first mortise and tenon joint. Happy with that result, it was time to start applying it to my white oak. What I'm doing here is I'm using my clamps as stops to prevent me from making my mortise too long. I would lower the bit with the depth adjustment, make a pass, and then lower the bit again and repeat the process, taking about 1/8 of an inch at a time. These are going to be 1/2-inch mortises, but I'm using a 1/4 inch down spiral bit from CMT. After I got the first half of the mortise done, then I would have to adjust my edge guide to do the other half. Using a chisel, I clean up the edges and square off the corners so that my rectangular tenons will fit. Speaking of tenons, remember that jig I used to make my tenons? Yeah, the shoulders turned out to be not so great, so I came back over to the table saw where I could get a better shoulder on the tenons using my crosscut sled. Thankfully, I learned that lesson early because I have quite a few more tenons to cut. It's better, not perfect, but better. Having the mortise and tenons done for the sides, I decided to do a dry fit while quality control inspected my tools. This is one of my favorite parts of a project where you've put in all this work and you finally start to see something come together. The design had these angled pieces in the sides and the back. I'm going to call them braces even though they are there for looks. To find the angle I needed to cut these tenons at, I would align these braces on the side and draw my line. Once I had that line, I would transfer it around the board. To figure out where the end of the tenon would be, I would simply measure up a 1/2 inch and make a line parallel to my other line all the way around the board. Over at the table saw, I cut down the brace to length. Since these are angled tenons, my previous way of making the tenons was not going to work. So I pulled out my miter gauge and set it to the appropriate angle. I made a cut the depth of the shoulder. Then I changed my miter gauge to the other side with the exact opposite angle and cut the other shoulder. Using my crosscut sled with a stop block set up, I cut the tenons down to my desired width. Watching this back, it looks like I could have used 2 stop blocks to wedge the piece in for better support. Something to think about on a future build. To make the short side of the shoulders, I'll turn the brace to the side and make a cut to the depth of the tenon. Then I will adjust my stop block to account for the angles and do it on the other side to get the opposite shoulder. I'm not going to cut these shoulders out using the table saw because I did not feel like making a jig or figuring out how to make a jig to get those angles correct. Instead, I pulled out my handy little flush trim saw. This thing is awesome. I use it on just about every project that I do. I'll drop you a link in the description, so check it out. Aligning the braces to where they are going to join into the top side apron, I mark where the tenons need to go. Using my pocket rule, I mark the shoulder for the inside and then the outside. The area that's being shaded is where the mortise will be cut out of the apron. What was that? Oh, you wanted a closer view? Here you go. Following the same process, I mark out where the mortises are going to go in the bottom apron. Cutting out the mortises using my router, I start to understand the draw behind the domino and promptly added it to my Amazon wish list. Grabbing my chisel, I squared off the corners of all the mortises, then started to dry fit all the pieces of the side together. Off camera, I did the exact same thing to the other side. Hey, it didn't fall apart. At this point in the project, knowing that there are certain grain patterns I would like to highlight and flaws I'd like to hide, I decided it would be a good time to label each tenon and corresponding mortise. That way, during assembly, it's easier to just look at the label and put everything together. My labeling method can vary based on the project. Here, I'm simply taking a letter, placing it beside the tenon, and putting the corresponding letter inside the mortise. Then I have an arrow indicating what side of the board is the top, as you see here. After getting everything labeled, I decided it was time to dry fit the whole table base together. I know that it's going to be slightly smaller dimensionally because of having to fix the shoulders, and I made some changes on the fly, so I will need to update some measurements before I continue. This was also a good opportunity to see what my better half thought about it.
All right, take 2 seconds. It's still really rough, but that gives you the idea.
I love it. I love it.
With that seal of approval, let's carry on. New measurements in hand, I cut the slats down to length. These slats are a 1/2 inch thick, and the idea is to use mortise and tenon to attach these to the aprons as well. They're supposed to sit flush with the top of the apron to form a shelf. The tenon is a 1/4 inch thick because that's how big the router bit is I'm going to use for my mortise. My concern is that's going to place my mortise 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the stock, increasing the chance for blowout when I'm routing out my mortises. To avoid this, I opt to move my tenon to the edge of the stock rather than the center, so my cuts look more like a rabbit. Maybe this is a rabbit and mortise joint, or rabbit hole joint. I don't know, I couldn't find a name for this whenever I Googled it. It's probably just called mortise and tenon. I like rabbit hole. If you know the name of this joint, leave it in the comments. Oh, and do me a favor while you're there and click that subscribe button. For those of you who are saying you're going to see the edge of the mortise where the rabbit goes in, I'm not concerned about that because it's going to be on the bottom of the shelf, so you'd have to flip the table over to see it. Whoa, rewind that. What was that? Oh, I see. I made an angle cut with my crosscut sled, which caused me to lose my zero clearance. Now it's spitting out these little cutoffs at me, illustrating the importance of having a zero clearance. So you can probably expect a crosscut sled video sometime in the future. Finally making the last cuts to get these tenons done. 60 cuts later. Didn't think about that while I was designing this table. What now? Who's hijacking my video?
Oh, hello. My dad is going to be working on stuff. Today he's going to be working on a table. And I'm going to take all of the black marks off. So I'm going to get ready. I'm not doing anything yet until my dad comes in here. He said, don't do anything yet.
That's right, don't do anything yet. I started training my young apprentice on how to correctly sand using the power sander, and she was doing pretty good, having a little bit of trouble keeping that sanding disc flat, but overall she did a good job. And then when she got bored, she handed it back to me. Number 2 showed up and started chatting my ear off as if I could hear him, probably talking about how he thinks power tools are not nearly as good as hand tools. Disenchanted with the music of the sander, he threw on some earmuffs and continued sanding. Also continued chatting my ear off, thinking I could hear him. After realizing I was getting more done a lot quicker, he decided he wanted to try the power sander. And I obliged, because the first thing I want to pass down about woodworking is the sanding part. Taking a break from sanding, I spaced out the slats on the aprons and marked where the mortises are going to be. These mortises are going to be the same size as my bits, so with my pocket rule, I only mark out one of the long sides. With everything marked up, I cut the first mortise. Before moving on, I do a test fit. Nice and snug. Now for the remaining 27 mortises. I probably could have gotten this video out a month earlier if it wasn't for all these slats. Quality Control's back again to check my work. He's really been hawking over me on this one. Dry fitting this shelf together turned out to be quite the challenge. Couldn't quite get all 14 of these to line up just right, and I kept trying to figure out the best way to do so. Finally, I got smart and laid it on its top. It went together pretty easily after that. Okay, after all that work, I do like how it looks. Does he have the glue out? You mean he's actually gonna glue something together? Why yes I am. It is time to get the sides glued up. This time, I'm not using my God-given glue spreader. I've got a little foam brush that I'm dipping in the glue and spreading on. Oh, well, that is a sign the friction fit's not that great, and I need more practice with mortise and tenon joints. Anyway, I was using a foam brush to spread the glue on the tenons and put it in the mortise. One side's done, on to the other. For those of you asking about my glue holder, it's a silicone baby plate. I decided to save myself a little bit of money and repurpose an old plate that we're no longer using. It works just as well as all the silicone glue holders out there you can buy. But you're not going to save any money over those glue holders by buying this because it's about the same price. I just already had it. With the glue dried and the sides out of their clamps, I had one last measurement to get before the final glue up. And that was the angle of the tenons for these back braces. So I reattached the aprons, held everything together with clamps, and then clamped the back braces into place, carefully maneuvering them until I was happy with their placement. Then I traced the shoulder angle onto the back brace. Grabbing my square, I mark lines on the aprons where the shoulders are going to line up to make it easier to line them up to cut the mortises. Then I head over to my table saw and cut the back braces down to length. These are the final cuts on the table saw for this build. It's kind of a joyous moment. And you're saying, but wait, you forgot to cut your tenons. Well, no, I'm going to try a third method and see how that works out.
As previously stated, this is my first time doing Mortise and Tenon joinery, and I picked a doozy of a project to start on. This project has 56 mortise and tenon joints in it. I've already cut 52 of those Mortise and Tenons. I was using my Ryobi palm router with a miles craft edge guide to cut the mortises. I was using the depth adjustment as kind of a plunge, even though it's not a plunge, it was working and somewhat serviceable. And I was cutting my tenons out with my table saw. It worked okay on the square edges, but on some of my angle cuts, the shoulders weren't that great. Well, yesterday was Christmas. And I found out that during the time I was cutting my first 52 mortise and tenon joints, this was sitting under my Christmas tree. Nice Bosch router with a plunge base. Super excited to try it. I am glad I've got 4 more mortise and tenons to cut, and I'm going to use this to do it. I went out and promptly bought the edge guide, so let's see how this works out.
With my new router set up and the edge guide in place, I started cutting my tenons. That's a nice line. I did have to get used to how much heavier this router was than my palm router. I expected a little bit heavier, but this thing was a good 4 to 5 times heavier. The handles did allow for a lot more control and greatly increased my confidence when I was routing. Of the 3 methods I used to cut tenons on this build, this was by far my favorite one. I still chose to use my flush trim saw to cut the short shoulders of these tenons. It was much easier than trying to figure out how to set the router up for these angles. On this board, as you can see, there was a crack in it and the router found it. So I'm just going to throw some tight bond in there, put some clamps on it, and let it dry. Cutting my mortises with this plunge router was awesome. I'd simply make a plunge on one end, go to the other end of the mortise, do the same thing, and then come back and make 1/8" passes until I was to depth, which of course this router stopped at because it has a depth stop. I love this thing. Another aspect I really enjoy about this router is the attachments for the dust collection. The edge guide I'm using has that, and there are other attachments for other bases, which makes for a lot less mess than the router I was using. Whew, that was the final mortise I had to cut out. With a quick fit test of the back braces, the finish line is in sight. Oh, I forgot. There's a lot more sanding left to do. Here's that piece that split earlier, all out of clamps. You can see where the glue up was. We'll run the sander over it a little bit and make that disappear. See? Good as new. And stronger. Not that it needs to be. And back to these slats. Sanding these things became quite a chore because they're kind of hard to hang on to and they're moving all over my table. I ended up just grabbing an old towel and clamping it to my workspace. Let me know in the comments below how you would keep these from sliding around. Time for the final glue up. With 28 mortise and tenons to glue up here, I needed a little extra working time, so I pulled out the Titebond 3. I wanted to go ahead and do the complete glue up, placing all the aprons into the frame so the whole table base is complete. The reason for that is I didn't want this little glue up of the shelf to be slightly off and throw my whole table off. Because you know, that would be aggravating. And with 28 mortise and tenons glued up, it would be quite a pain to fix. Once all the slats were inserted and carefully aligned, I flipped it over and applied some clamps. Clamps in place, I picked it up and headed over to where I had the sides waiting on the other side of my shop, where I proceeded with the final glue up and assembly of the table base. Assembly complete. I put the table over on its feet. Hey, that rhymes. Let's move this camera so you can see a little bit better. There we go. Using my strap clamp, I get the top part of this table clamped together. I only have one of these strap clamps, so I grabbed a ratchet strap for the bottom. I only used enough pressure to hold everything together, that way I don't damage the wood. Oh, look, more sanding. We get the joy of a nice sanding montage as I sand the top. Oh, never mind. Remember when I was cutting the legs for my table and found the fence was tilted in at the top and hope it didn't come back to bite me? Yeah, my table's about 1/8 of an inch out of square. I'm thinking it's because of that. I did anticipate me having some issues being an amateur and this being my first time to take on Mortise and Tenon joinery, so I did leave my tabletop a little bit larger than the base in order to come back with my flush trim bit on my router and flush everything up. This bit wasn't my favorite, but then again it was a $20 budget bit off of Amazon. Christmas was good to me this year. Along with getting the router, I also got this nice CMT Forstner bit set. Let's break it in, shall we? I'm going to be using figure 8 fasteners to attach the top to the table base. The fasteners need to be inset by about 2 millimeters, so I'm going to use my Forstner bit to create the insets. With the finish line in sight, it's time to add some finish. See what I did there? Finish and finish line. Okay then, moving on. For this project, I chose Rubio Monocoat in the Smoke Pigmented Edition. I mixed the Rubio into a cup with the accelerator and then poured a little bit out on my workpiece. Using a squeegee, I spread it out across the tabletop and worked it into the grain. Then I took a rag and wiped it all off. I'm really happy with how the Rubio highlighted the grain patterns. For the base, I applied as much Rubio as I could with a foam brush in 5 minutes, then came back and wiped it off with a rag. Moved to the next section and repeated the process till I had completely covered the base. After the Rubio had cured for a few days, I pre-drilled the holes for screws and attached my figure 8 fasteners. Then with a little bit of help from Dad, we flipped the base over onto the top so that I could attach it. I began marking out my screw holes. Then I remembered I had a set of self-centering drill bits and I just needed to use them to drill the holes. Oh, you're back. Brisket sandwich. I smoked this brisket and my wife made some awesome sourdough sandwich bread. Wow, that's good. Thank you all for watching that video. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, check the description down below. There's links to some plans and all the tools that I used. And while I finish this amazing sandwich, y'all should check out some of the other videos that I've worked on, like this one.